What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 161. I'm the co-host Kyle Anzalone. I'm joined by the co-host Will Porter today. Will, how you doing?
I'm doing all right, Kyle. How you doing tonight?
Doing well, and Will, we have passed the 20th anniversary of 9/11 this past weekend, and these past 20 years for me and you are the majority of our lives, and so we're
Yeah.
really going to, take the first part of the show tonight and look back on these past 20 years and kind of what it's meant for us and some of the significant ways that this has really changed the country that we live in from the time, we are kids in the 1990s to now.
Yeah.
So all that and more on today's show. Share the show, everyone. You find it at the Libertarian Institute, libertarianinstitute.org/Kyle for a full archive of the show. You can find it on YouTube, Rumble, and Odyssey. Video versions of the show. We put like maps sometimes, all the articles we talk about, other different graphics, and of course the great news ticker that we have. So a lot of great stuff. If you are looking at the video version, just be sure to subscribe and share the show wherever you listen to it. Help it get out there to more people. The show's really been growing over the past couple of months, and we really want to keep that momentum up. And part of that is, our listeners hitting the share button and recommending it to people. So for all of you who could do that, we really appreciate it. It helps out. You can find the show on any of our social media accounts. Facebook and MeWe, it's just Conflicts of Interest. Twitter is at @con_interest. And then you can support the show either crypto. The information is in the show notes page, or Patreon. Subscribe starting again. You can find the link in the show notes page. You can also support the show and get yourself some great CBD products at Paloma Verde. PalomaVerdeCBD.com is the URL, and they have a fantastic selection of CBD products there. Also, they have the lab tester results for their CBD products, so you're getting high quality products. And they also have a nice education tab on the website if you're new to CBD to figure out how it might help you. You always use the promo code PEACE when you check out. That lets them know that the show sent you, and it gets you a 25% discount. Will, I'm always talking about how much I like their topicals at Paloma Verde, but I know you like some of their other products, so what do you enjoy?
Yeah, I mean, they have all kinds of stuff. They even have stuff for your pets, I think. But the products I prefer most are the melatonin soft gels that kind of help you wind down at night and help me with my insomnia issues. They also have ones with curcumin and different formulations in their soft gels. I like those a lot. I like their high dose oil tincture. That's for when you just want to get the biggest dose of CBD possible. So if that stuff is sounds interesting to you, or if, like Kyle said, they have lab results and educational resources, go to Paloma Verde CBD store, CBD.com. And use the promo code PEACE.
All right, well, let's get into it. And the first thing we have today is a statement from somebody who we've talked fairly highly of on the show, Tulsi Gabbard. She was a presidential candidate in 2020 and the one that did bring the most attention to the war issue. However, as we've always said, Tulsi isn't anti-war, and she has some issues and really does believe in the war on terror, and that terrorism is a problem. However, her response to 9/11, her statement, Will, is truly appalling. For people watching, we have it up here, but if you're just listening, she has this on Facebook. I believe she also put this as a Twitter thread. She says, "Let us never forget that it was the Islamic ideology that inspired the terrorist attacks and declaration of war against America on 9/11. And it is this Islamist ideology that continues to fuel terrorist attacks around the world and is the foundation for the so-called Islamic countries like Pakistan, Turkey, Iran, and Saudi Arabia's discriminatory policies against Christians, Hindus, Buddhists, atheists, etc." Will, that was shocking to read that from her, especially on 9/11 when she seemed to, in the past at least, be somebody to understand the importance of taking these opportunities to really push the idea of bringing troops home. But rather, she's saying that we need to continue to fight the wars because this Islamist ideology continues to exist. And I found this rather disturbing, Will, and honestly, this is the kind of thing that makes it so never support Tulsi again. She clearly doesn't understand this issue. She doesn't understand the blowback, and she's so just unaware of how, events have played out in the world over the past few decades, thinks that like terrorism is an action that's solely linked to Islam. So, Will, I'll let you take on whatever you want here, but this was quite the disturbing statement.
Yeah, I mean, like with Tulsi, there's always kind of been this thing with her where like her whole shtick was always like end the, stop the regime change wars and stop backing the terrorists. Like in Syria, the Obama administration gave a lot of aid and money and stuff to these like, Islamist hardline groups. And she was always good on stuff like that. But she did always kind of have this sort of like terror war rhetoric about radical Islam and kind of that right wing kind of shtick. I guess she was in the military. Some people in the military have that kind of like mentality. However, of course, the statement she came out with on 9/11 was just ridiculous and horrible. Like she could have used this opportunity, like you said, to call for peace, to call to bring troops home, but yet she turned it into this very jingoistic kind of thing. And I think there's evidence that cuts against this idea that Islam in particular like drives people toward suicide or toward suicide terrorism. There's actually work by Robert Pape, I think, Dying to Win, that gets into like suicide terrorism and the causes behind it. And it's not Islam. It's not religion. It's usually foreign occupation is typically the cause of that type of thing. And so that completely cuts against this narrative that Tulsi is trying to back, that, oh, it's Islam driving terrorism. Now, certainly across the Islamic world, there's all kinds of despotic governments and bad regimes. Some of them do use, they justify the bad things they do with the Quran, with Islam. But I think if you'll take a look across a lot of the world, you'll see a lot of despotism, and it's not just confined to Islamic countries. So
right.
I just think Tulsi was totally off, totally wrong with this statement.
Yeah, one of the things that really upset me here, Will, and I think it goes to show some of Tulsi's shortcomings on the foreign policy issue, is you don't even have to look outside the Middle East to find a completely totalitarian and apartheid regime that
That's right.
that like Israel declares this, it has named itself the Jewish state, like it has a Jewish state law. Like this
Right.
isn't just saying like, oh, because the government is Jewish we're calling it the Jewish state. Israel proclaims itself to be the Jewish state, and in the Jewish state the Muslim people essentially don't have rights, and so that seems to be a real issue for Tulsi's whole thing here, that is somehow a unique aspect of Islam, that people in the Middle East aren't free. I guess I the worst part of it to me really is that she just adopts the complete neocon narrative. I mean, this could have been put out by Dick Cheney, that right. Two planes came out of the clear blue sky on 9/11, hit our buildings, knocked them over, and the Islamic world declared war on the United States because it's a clash of civilizations. They just can't be okay with infidels existing across the Atlantic Ocean, and so they have to come here and kill us. And buying into that is absolutely unacceptable, and we just can't push that. That's the narrative that we have to fight against. And here you had somebody who was one of the better voices on the war issue, and because of that has unfortunately a lot of times, even by libertarians, just kind of like, oh, well, Tulsi's anti-war. No, she's not anti-war. She's never been. But this is like full neocon here, and again, very disturbing. Anything else on this, Will?
Yeah. I would just say there, I think, are two serious errors here. One is mistaking the general overall cause of terrorism, and like I said, is not religion. And then the second was more specific of mistaking the cause of 9/11 itself, which we kind of have a lot of evidence and stuff to point toward. It was U.S. policies, U.S. occupations and bombings and sanctions of other countries that led to those attacks. So it is really unfortunate Tulsi got this so wrong, and that really just puts on display that, yeah, all along she's really not been that great on this issue.
Yep. All right, well, the next thing I had was this great article by Kelly Vallejos in the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. It's right now the spotlight today on antiwar.com. It says the title is Day of Reckoning for the Media Handmaidens of War. And Kelly goes through in the past 20 years. And of course, this thing isn't an entire book. Well, it'd probably be a series of books. So she can't hit on everyone. But she does highlight just some of the more egregious things that have happened in the media over the past 20 years that have allowed this perpetual war to happen, including, she starts off with this thing from December 2011 where it's Diane Rem and David Ignatius, and they're talking, and they basically admit that they really, really botched the whole weapons of mass destruction thing. But it's absolutely insane, Will, that this was 10 years ago now. where we've had the lies of Russiagate, the Syrian chemical weapons attacks, lies about Iran's nuclear program, conflation of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, constantly from the mainstream media. It seems that they've actually learned nothing, or if they did learn anything from the lead up to, the Iraq war, is that, hey, if you want to make a lot of money, it might cost the lives of some Iraqis, but if you go along with the government narrative and push this war, the ratings are going to be really good. The advertising dollars from the military industrial complex are going to be really good. And then we're going to set up little deals where, the think tanks funded by the military industrial complex, those people will sign deals with the networks to come on and be the talking heads and everything like that. And so one of the things that she brings up pretty early on, that this is so long ago, Will, that this name, the first one, Phil Donahue, he's kind of before my time. But apparently he was an anti-war voice within the mainstream media and lost his job in the lead up to the Iraq war because he opposed it. They apparently replaced his show, Kelly says, with Countdown Iraq, hosted by Lester Holt. And so this was, went from being one of the only, I don't even know if he was an anti-war voice, but, war skeptical voice in the mainstream media, to being replaced with a show that was Countdown to the Great War because it's going to help our ratings. That is, one thing maybe we could take a second here, Will. I'm curious if you remember the lead up to the Iraq war. And Scott Horn has talked a little bit about this with the Waco thing, where basically you get impatient waiting for it to happen. It was just day after day of this exciting thing, to me as a kid, this just exciting thing that was going to happen, and it wasn't coming, and I just wanted it to be over with. So not only would it happen, but then things would go back, no more interruption by Power Rangers for a breaking news update about Iraq or anything.
Right. Yeah, it just builds up such anticipation.
Yeah, there's something real nefarious about that. Also, she points out that Jesse Ventura, who is somebody I'm more familiar with, was fired from his MSNBC show. And then there was a name on here she brought up that I wasn't familiar with. It was Alicia Banfield, who actually was reporting for NBC on 9/11. But when she came out against the war, she says that she was banished. And so this is, just another example of how they create consensus. If anybody who is remotely opposed to the war or even skeptical of it is removed from the mainstream media, well, then there's the range of opinion is going to be pro-war, because, to dissent from that, you have to be critical of the people on TV. And it's hard to be critical of the people on TV because a lot of people will look at you like you're crazy. Will, how dare you say that the Iraqis don't have WMDs? How do you know? Because the general on TV said so. In fact, Kelly points out that at this time, 75% of the people on the news giving commentary were current or former government officials, and a lot of those were, military officials just going on saying, we got to do this, we got to do this, we got to do this. Well, I'm curious if you remember this one. This really scared me as a kid. The whole we don't want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud. I actually had when Bush said it in the intro of the Foreign Policy Focus show. But this was a really terrifying thing, right? That we couldn't wait to bomb Iraq because we may get nuked. And honestly, just to show how I think indoctrinated I was with this fear, but I think it was just a part of the propaganda. I really believe that when I went to school in the morning, there was a chance that my parents wouldn't come home because there would be a terrorist attack, and it was only our brave men and women overseas that were keeping me safe and allowing my parents to go to work and come home safely and all that. But there was always the risk of the terrorist attack, and a lot of that, for me at least, had to do with the idea that a nuclear bomb was going to be set off somewhere. They talked about a dirty bomb or a nuclear bomb, and then
I remember specifically being terrified as a little kid when the news was instructing you how to duct tape and seal your windows in case of a biological weapons attack and all this. It was during all the threat level color codes and all that stuff. It was insane.
Or like when people were afraid to check the mail because of anthrax.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
I mean, I guess there was anthrax, but it wasn't coming from Al Qaeda. That seemed like a pretty important point of that whole story.
I still
Um,
don't really know what's up with all that anthrax thing. Never was really solved, but whatever.
right. Let's see. There's the other quote that really got me was the axis of evil, and it was
Hmm.
just it painted such this black and white hat picture. And of course, like remember, I'm 13 years old, and so I really don't have the like my brain can't critically think enough about this at this time, and I'm just kind of absorbing whatever the propaganda put out in front of me is, and that was another one that I really bought into. There is some quotes in here from Matt Taibbi that are really important, explaining that one of the things that happened in Iraq and Afghanistan is that the media was embedded with the military rather than being in Iraq and Afghanistan. Right?
Yeah.
They were there with the military. That means they talked to the people that the military set them up to talk to. You probably the other side is probably more skeptical of you, like the Taliban, if you're teaming up with the Americans and stuff like that. So I have to guess that that really did, and Taibbi says it basically ensured that only American perspective of the war was ever given.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there's all kinds of other like biased reasons within the military that they didn't really show the perspective of the Iraqis and Afghans, but at the same time, I'm sure just like kind of it's very easy to go along with it if you're just with those soldiers. Like they probably become your friends. I'm sure like you're experiencing some of the same PTSD that the soldiers are with the level of danger that you're in.
Yeah.
You're in a war zone. Even if you're on the base, you're maybe not going out on some of the more dangerous missions. It's still nerve wracking, and the guys keeping you safe are the people you're reporting on. So like,
Right.
you may have like some real incentive to not say anything bad about them.
Yeah.
Then one more like thing in this article, Will, that I thought was really important. She brings up the stories of Jessica Lynch and Pat Tillman, which I
Yeah.
remember as a kid being very impactful on me. And I didn't even realize till I was an adult that Pat Tillman was killed by friendly fire. He was not
Yes.
killed by the Taliban.
Correct. Yeah, he was killed by a fellow U.S. soldier. I was just reading about that like a month ago. That's funny.
Yeah,
Or it's
so
not funny.
well, yeah, in the dark sense of the word, because the
Right.
Pentagon, we care about the troops, we care about the troops, we care about the troops, and here you have a troop that was killed again by friendly fire, and they knowingly propagandized his death, allowed it to be put out that he was like died in some heroic thing,
Right.
saving
Football
people.
man.
Yeah, from the Taliban and everything. Yeah, that's another. People might not know that Pat Tillman was an NFL player who decided to go fight in the war.
That's right. Yeah. Pro football player.
Yeah, so I don't know if you had anything else on all this, Will, but I just thought was one of the most important parts is how our media has been so responsible for allowing this to continue for so long.
Yeah, I mean, I think it makes sense why this stuff continues, considering who they keep hiring as their pundits. I mean, look at who's working at MSNBC right now. John Brennan is one of their pundits, the former director of the CIA. James Clapper is also employed as, I think, at CNN as an analyst. So, it kind of makes sense why the media keeps repeating all these same errors over and over again, because all the same people, they keep relying on them. They never, the people who get it completely wrong, and someone like Clapper who directly lied to Congress and the American people about the level of NSA spying, like that stuff just doesn't affect their career. They get a slot on TV, whereas someone like Phil Donahue, if he's even a little bit skeptical, he's purged. And so I think it makes sense why this kind of stuff goes on. And yes, the post 9/11 reporting was just crazy. Like the stuff in the lead up to the Iraq War, the way the White House was like feeding intelligence to Judith Miller, and then Judith Miller was like refeeding that back. It was just it was a crazy like laundering of information. And 9/11 really did like supercharge that trend, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, there's so much in the past 20 years, and one of the things that we are working on is a heroes and villains, using those words like kind of tongue-in-cheek, of the Afghan war. I know that some of the people that I did in the heroes episode probably don't like being called heroes, so I didn't put it in there, but
Right.
you gotta say heroes and villains because it goes well together. And in that, I do want to, and I'm gonna start capturing the next couple weeks a lot of the people most responsible for all of this, and I think that's going to be really important, although I don't think we'll ever be able to capture everybody.
Yeah, it's too damn many.
as much as there's been like real blows to like, you know, the field of journalism, there's been major losses of freedom all over the world, but in the United States, and not to only focus on the domestic repercussions of like these endless wars and everything like that, because, you know, the lives of the people in Afghanistan and Iraq are far worse. Typically that's what we're talking about on the show, is what's happening there. So I did want to take a second to look at this op-ed in The Hill from Christopher Coyne, I believe, and he just writes here that the domestic legacy of our global war on terror, and he points to three major things that really were exacerbated in the U.S., and of course that's the mass surveillance from originally the Patriot Act, now the USA Freedom Act, but no matter how you look at it, that plus the FISA courts basically means that we don't have Fourth Amendment protections anymore. The FBI could do sneak and peeks all over the place, and on top of that, they store all of our communications, and I think now they usually have the third-party providers hold it, but they could get their hands on that anytime they want and see what you've been doing and who you've been talking to. And, you know, freedom, especially with all the technology that we have around us and really makes our lives great, is also somewhat of a double-edged sword because of the dangers of government and being able to use that information against us. He also talks about the second domestic legacy of the war on terror is the militarization of domestic police forces. According to one estimate, since 9/11, the Department of Defense has transferred $1.6 billion worth of equipment to law enforcement agencies for items like mine-resistant vehicles, machine guns, grenade launchers, and military aircraft. Will, I mean, we could talk about the absurdity of this all day long. One of the examples I remember is that somehow the Los Angeles school system, their police ended up with grenade launchers. When I lived and worked in New Hampshire, Dover, New Hampshire, a town of tens of thousands of people at the most, peaceful little place where the biggest news for years was an arson that happened. I worked in the building where underneath in the parking garage, they had a Bearcat, like a big armored vehicle. You know, and they would usually just take it out and wax it and show it off at like the events in the town and stuff like that. But you know, these things are all over the place. And the last thing that he captures, and I don't think this is maybe the biggest result of the war on terror, but isn't something that I've ever heard talked about before as being a result of the war on terror. And he makes a good argument here, and that is the civil asset forfeiture program, which again existed before, and I think does have some of its like roots in like breaking up criminal enterprise and stuff like that. But over the terror war, they've really been able to exacerbate this because, you know, organized crime essentially became, you know, like kind of a terrorism investigation type thing too. So there's a lot of that. Of course, there's something that we talk about in the show a lot more too, which is like manufacturing all these terrorism cases and how that's like now built into this problem where they're using it to manufacture like the plot against Gretchen Whitmer and stuff like that. But that's I think that's pretty much all I have. Just a reminder that even though the war in Afghanistan is over, our torture prison on the Cuban island, Guantanamo Bay, is still open. There's still people in there who legitimately aren't accused of being terrorists. They're at best like accused of being associates of people who were somehow involved with Al Qaeda, but that's certainly, you know, 20 years they've now done, you know, in Guantanamo Bay torture prison for this. And Brett Wilkins has a good article on this where, you know, he gets into like how cruel some of this torture was, where if this happened to women, we would call it rape. Like they like put their hands on male sex organs. That's, I think, rape. And, you know, yeah, right. And for the express purpose of causing sexual arousal to make them violate like their religious faith. And so that's kind of why because it's like for a sexual reason. That seems rapey to me.
Definitely.
I don't know exactly where the line on that is, but waterboarding, they've tortured people to death, all kinds of stress positions. They put people in coffins with buds and other, just like the most horrific things that you could think of. And of course, all these lunatics that did this are running around, and most of them have gotten promoted and are rich. George
Right.
Bush is giving a speech about 9/11. Dick Cheney isn't dead yet, so he could still be thrown in prison. George Tenet is Brennan is on TV. All these
Rami's
people,
gone.
right? Mitchell and Jessam, the Nazi doctor psychologist that put together the torture program, they got $80 million out of it. That money could be taken from them. There's people that could be held accountable for all that still. Just want to remember that. Now, Will, I'm interested in 9/11 for you. What'd you have on it? And of course, it's kind of interesting today, right? They you grew up in this war and now you're reporting against it. I
Right.
think it would probably be hard to imagine for little William Porter on 9/11 sitting there probably in elementary school classroom, imagining he's going to be reporting on the war that starts in a month.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, you just did such a fantastic job outlining just all the various ways that, there's so many different repercussions and different ways this has affected our society, and, just endless ways. However, yeah, just to get into more sort of my personal, experience and memories with this, I believe I was 8 years old the day of the 9/11 attacks. And I do remember exactly where I was when I first heard and saw, the towers and stuff. um Throughout the day, I remember kids had been being parents were pulling their kids out of class, and so like it seemed like something weird was going on. There was some sense that like some weird, something was happening. But I was 8 at the time, and I remember thinking that it had something to do with the West Nile virus for some reason. Like that was the theory that my 8-year-old brain came up with, was there was a swarm of mosquitoes that carrying the West Nile, and that's why everyone was being pulled out of class. But I was not pulled out of class. But when I got home from school that day, I immediately did see the images of the collapsing towers on TV. And honestly, I don't really remember what like my parents or my teachers or like the elders in my life like told me about this. I don't really remember how they tried to explain this to me as a little kid. Um, However, I do recall just like the endless media coverage and this new war on terror that came after. And even like at that young age, at some point, I did realize there was some like level of hype that was driving this. And I just remember like being kind of annoyed that like every time I turned on the TV, it was just nothing nonstop, and nothing but the war on terror, and all this stuff. So I do kind of recall being a little skeptical of it even when I was really young. But it was around the age of 13 when I saw this documentary. I guess if that's what you want to call it, this film called Zeitgeist, and that was sort of one of the OG like 9/11 conspiracy movies, and that sent me down this big crazy rabbit hole through the conspiracy world. I spent a lot of my teen years like being a 9/11 truther and being into all the inside job stuff. Um, and nowadays, I am far less confident about a lot of the things I used to believe. I think, I had bought into some things that maybe I couldn't have proved. I can't prove now. Clearly, there were some very shady things surrounding the attacks, like whether it's the role of Saudi royals in funding and planning the attacks, as is seen in the 28 pages, or even like the weird places that like Israeli intelligence seems to keep popping up in relation to the plot, like Justin Raimondo and Ryan Dawson have shown in their work. So there is, and also I'm sure our
Can
listeners
I
are
add,
familiar. Oh, go ahead.
there's a great article today at antiwar.com by Ray McGovern going through some of the intelligence failures and just, like, this could have, like, there were a lot of ways 9/11 could have been prevented.
Yes.
Colin Rowley was very interested in investigating the people in Minnesota. There was an agent that almost busted the guys in Arizona, I think, or New Mexico, somewhere in the Southwest. It might have even been San Diego.
Yeah.
And then there was recommendations from like 1988 through 1998 from the FAA to put lots on the doors to the cockpit. They found time and time again that this was like an issue that could easily be prevented with some relatively cheap lots, and they just didn't reform that. I think
Right.
even that David Tennant had been warned, and like whenever 9/11 happened, he was like, oh, it happened that way. And
Right.
then there were some like listening posts, I think in Yemen was where they were trying to listen to conversations too. And
Yes.
because the NSA and CIA are just so idiotic. I don't even know what the correct word is to
Yeah, stubborn,
describe
I guess.
stubborn, idiotic, just so concerned about their own budget over the security of the American people that they don't
Yep.
like to share intelligence, and they end up only recording half of the conversation, and it all, if they had the whole thing, I think Ali Soufan thinks they would have been able to stop it, right? I think they brought Ali Soufan in Yemen on the day, and he was like, oh
Yeah.
my god, this is everything we needed.
Yeah, and
um,
Michael Scheuer, the former the head of the CIA's Bin Laden unit, Alex Station, he tells this whole story, and he's like spitting mad about it that the other intelligence agencies refused to cooperate with the CIA to get these important communications that could have potentially stopped the attacks.
And then there's one other thing that Ray McGovern points out in his article that I think is really important, and that's there were two guys in the U.S. who were very suspicious, but the CIA didn't pass that information on to the FBI, and McGovern thinks that they were trying to basically flip these guys. And
Right.
so it's kind of curious maybe how much contact the CIA had with them, and maybe they got played, had a little Oklahoma City go down on them, where essentially they just get drug along by the informants, and the informants are able to pull out the attack right on the nose of the feds. I
That's
think
right.
that's entirely possible. But Will, I interrupt your thing, go ahead.
No, no, you're all good. Like that was all very important stuff. Like there's a very big list of things for why people might, be skeptical about the 9/11 attacks that don't make you a conspiracy kook. I'm sure a lot of our listeners are familiar with the whole dancing Israelis thing, which is all very weird. There's just a lot of like strange stuff that I think remains unexplained to this day. And so like my point is just sort of that 9/11 was very pivotal for me, it was the first kind of major thing where I was like, exposed to the idea that the government might lie or cover things up on like a massive scale. And even if some of the things that I thought they lied or covered up, like I now believe now, like I was probably wrong about, still it was very influential for me in just like thinking this way. So like even though I've kind of dropped some of the more kooky stuff, it did instill this great skepticism in government in me that I think is that's kind of led me into doing this kind of stuff I do now. Um, but I think along the way, like, from going from this whole conspiracy kind of world to the journalism world, I kind of picked up a better understanding of like sourcing and backing up your claims and, proving what you have to say. Because, like, I think people like us, like anti-war, anti-establishment types, like we face a more uphill battle. Like we really have to be extra careful with our sources. We have to be extra solid. And I think that is kind of the lesson I learned with, going from this conspiracy stuff into journalism. And that all started for me with 9/11 and, trying to investigate what might have happened there and whether our government was covering it up. So, of course, 9/11 had this incredible effect, kicking off the war on terror. It had this huge society-wide effect that's affected, millions and millions of people. But for me, that was sort of my personal relation to the attacks. It kind of like sent me into this whole world of, of just being curious about U.S. policy and what we're doing overseas and militant groups and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I gotta say, I that last part, it really has driven me. The lies I was told and the impact it had on me and what it made me believe has really driven me to be, so passionate about this subject.
Right.
How evil these people are, truly evil, to make people so hateful and to make people okay with killing so many innocent people on the other side of the world just for your own profits. Because
Yeah.
that was, really the only winners of these wars has been the military-industrial complex. Well, the last thing I had to say on this is, of course, now that the war in Afghanistan is over, I think there maybe is a real opportunity for some natural pressure to repeal the 2001 2002 authorization for use of military force laws. That's not going to fix this problem. I don't think that, but at least it is like better to have those off the books. And then to
Absolutely.
close Gitmo, I would say are the two things that maybe getting rid of the USA Freedom Act, although I think that's probably more of an uphill battle, in relation to ending 9/11. But certainly I think the other two may be things that could really be pushed for as the war's now over. Like, how are you going to keep your torture prison over for it?
Right, right. Yeah, absolutely. And the one thing I would add to that, and this is of course not likely, but is abolishing the DHS. There's absolutely no damn reason we need a Department of Homeland Security.
Yeah. And TSA, they haven't prevented an attack yet. So
That's right. Really, all the damn 17 intelligence agencies. What are they? What are they worth? You know?
Right. All right. Well, let's move on. Talk about some COVID stuff here. We have, I think, a good amount of news on this
Yes.
this week. Biden came out and gave a big speech, and it seems that medical martial law is here. That the government essentially can assert whatever it wants as far as what medicine that we have to comply with, and there's not going to be a whole lot of room for exemptions. I'm not sure, Will, what your position is. I guess me and you may be some of the few who aren't directly impacted by this, but this is going to be millions and millions of Americans required to either get the vaccine or take a weekly test. And I know we just have a bunch of stuff on COVID, so go ahead, Will.
Yeah, sure, sure. Yeah, so I think there's sort of like two categories of like major COVID stories this week. One is the big announcement from the White House that you just hit on, that how they're like slowly ratcheting up these various like vaccine mandates and restrictions and requirements, exactly in line with how we've been predicting and describing on the show for months now, that they're going to be rolling this out in a very piecemeal kind of way. And then the other big story this week is there was a trove of documents obtained by The Intercept that appear to show that the U.S. government did fund some dangerous coronavirus research in China, specifically at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. But let's start with the announcements first, which I actually broke down in a recent Twitter thread. People watching the show might be able to see that put up on the screen. So yeah, the big thing here is the Biden administration has effectively imposed a federal vaccine mandate. But they're doing it in this kind of piecemeal, like indirect way, using regulatory powers in federal agencies instead of just like straight up doing it through an executive order. So I had explained in the show before how they started mandates for federal workers, and then they expanded that to healthcare workers at facilities that receive Medicare and Medicaid funding, which I think was like 1.6 million healthcare workers at the time. But in this latest step, now they're going to use OSHA, the occupational safety like department. They're going to use OSHA to enforce vaccine requirements at any company with more than 100 employees, which the White House is saying will affect around 80 million workers. So, very large group of the large swath of the country. Now they do have the option of weekly testing, but like obviously that's a huge burden to put on people's lives, and I expect a lot of people will probably get the shot just specifically to avoid that. And then
And
another issue.
Will, was there any indication on funding for those weekly tests or anything like that? If
That, that's
that'll come
exactly what I was
out,
about to say.
okay, go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, like, it's not totally clear who would be footing the bill for this weekly testing. The New York Times actually tried to answer this question in an article they did, and they didn't really come up with anything definitive. Like, it is actually possible, it's feasible that employees themselves could actually have to foot the full cost for these tests, which again would, like, coerce people. I think it would kind of force their hand, where people would be getting the vaccine simply because they can't afford, this testing. There is the possibility that insurance would cover it, but it's kind of like it's a complicated mess with the federal regulations and with how this stuff has all been implemented. It's not totally clear, how this stuff would be paid for. So there is this OSHA thing where it's like this is a de facto federal vaccine mandate, I would say, for a huge swath of the U.S. population. And then remember the 1.6 million healthcare workers I mentioned a minute ago. Now they've expanded that mandate to cover 17 million medical workers, because now they're expanding new vaccine requirements at different types of medical facilities. So that number is also growing. And they've done the same thing with the federal mandate for employees at federal agencies, where now it's federal contractors and other types of staffers who will be covered under these mandates. So, like, as we've been pointing out, I think kind of all along on the show, the number of people who are federally required to be vaccinated in one way or another is growing very fast. The White House, I think, is not likely to ever come out and just say, like, okay, vaccines are now mandatory for the whole country. And they've even said they're not going to do that. Like, so they would have to go back on a promise to do that. But what they will, I think, do is to keep doing piecemeal, incremental moves like this, where they grow and extend these mandates, step by step until I think they cover basically everyone. And I can't even imagine right now, too, how the booster shots are going to complicate all this. Because as we've discussed before, like what it means to be fully vaccinated is no longer set in stone. Originally, that used to mean 2 doses of Pfizer or Moderna or 1 dose of Johnson & Johnson. Now, like, who knows where this ends and how these mandates will interact with all this booster shot stuff. And so, like if they're telling millions and millions of people they have to get this, they have to be fully vaccinated, quote unquote, yet they can't even define what fully vaccinated means. I just can't see this being anything but a disaster, an absolute train wreck. for our economy, for our country, for our entire society, for what it means for human liberty. These mandates, it just seems they're going to continue escalating and growing in this way, and it is alarming, I think.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. Well, I think it's going to essentially be like a place where maybe Thomas Massey talked about something that maybe people could do would be contract work, because then you aren't technically an employee. And so, since it seems that that's the route the Biden administration is really looking, but that's just at this point. Who knows what is going to come next as far as maybe travel or something like that. There's an awful lot of people within the establishment who are really looking at, wanting to do more, including the CNN Dr. Wen. She was really pushing that like everybody should be required to get a vaccine right away. Now, one thing that seems kind of that raises my red flags about COVID so much is how much of it reminds me of the like kind of post 9/11 years, where everything is really scary. You can't tell exactly who the enemy is. Like now, you kind of know that some vaccinated people are the ones you got to worry about, but you can't tell which unvaccinated people is the one that's like as some people would say, like a walking like bioterrorist. Not that I believe that, but some people would say that. Totally. With that, the fact that they always miss their marks, they're like, oh, the vaccine will make it so you don't get it. Oh, well, now you can have a breakthrough case with the vaccine. Oh, now you could die with the vaccine, but it probably will make it less serious. Yeah. That moving goalposts over and over again, and then really never having to reckon with the fact that you moved the goalposts a lot, and that the people who were skeptical from the very beginning were actually right. Like, those are just things that you would think they would have to acknowledge. There are, like, times where you have, like, Russiagate-esque stories that are just obviously completely untrue. Like the people in the Rolling Stone article that they claimed were all overdosing on the, generic medicine that some famous podcasters take. Right. And, the whole media has been calling the thing a horse medicine for the past few weeks when, it's a medicine designed for humans that also works for some livestock. But, just because biological things are biological doesn't mean that, it's all horse medicine. And, just so much of the propaganda. And now you really have almost, if you're not with us, you're for the virus. Of jingoism and slogan going on. But the one place it reminds me of the most is this whole idea that we really don't have to get to the bottom of it, right? Like, there's so little concern on how the whole COVID thing started and who potentially was responsible for funding it that really, really, really raises all my red flags, Will. Because this seems like, maybe after developing vaccines and treatments, probably the most important thing, but it doesn't have to come after. The U.S. government spent $6 trillion last year. You can't allocate $100 billion, like a small fraction of the money. That would be an insane amount of money to spend on investigation, but give them all the money they need, track down how the hell this virus came about. And they haven't done that. So we've covered it on the show for well over a year now. The possibility that this wasn't just some biological thing that happened. Somehow that it was asserted that this was somehow the racist proposal of the two, even though we were the ones saying that, it's not because people in China have wet markets and eat crazy stuff like a lot of other people are saying. But we got some new information on this from The Intercept, Will. So let us know what's going on here.
Yeah, sure. And yeah, not to toot my own horn too much, but like I have been talking about the Wuhan Institute of Virology since January 2020. So like within weeks of COVID even being reported at all as an international news story, like I was, kind of hip to this idea. However, there are these new 900 pages of documents that pertain to U.S. government-funded coronavirus research at that Wuhan Institute of Virology. And there is some interesting stuff in there. Specifically, some of these documents involve a U.S.-based org called the EcoHealth Alliance, and this is a group that carried out research, and they received nearly $4 million in federal funding, specifically for coronavirus research. And some of that money was devoted to work at the Wuhan lab. I think something like $600,000 of that was used there. And in these documents, there is one page that kind of hints at the danger of the work that they were doing, because they had to. Part of it was going into these bat caves to collect samples, and they said that there was a high risk of exposing the workers to coronaviruses. So there's that. However, the more interesting thing here in these documents, I think, relates to what is known as gain of function research, which I think we have discussed in the show before. But like basically, the idea is that they make viruses more deadly and transmissible in the lab so that they can better like study them and figure out how to kill them and that that kind of thing. That's sort of the general idea. However, there are some scientists out there who think that this type of work is too dangerous to do because obviously it risks like unleashing these super deadly, super infectious pathogens on the population. And so there has been a lot of speculation and claims and stuff that something like this may have happened at the Wuhan lab, that the virus somehow escaped from the lab and that the virus itself had somehow been altered maybe for this research in a way that made it more dangerous. And to be totally clear, this whole lab leak theory, like it is not proven by any means. Like I'm not sure there's even any like really hard evidence for it at all. Beyond just like the basic plausibility that, a coronavirus outbreak just happened to begin in the exact city where they're possibly doing this dangerous research on coronaviruses. So like it is understandable why people find something fishy here. However, regardless of the lab leak idea, whether the US government had funded gain of function research is a separate question. And the White House, the top COVID advisor at the White House, Anthony Fauci, he has repeatedly denied that his agency ever approved any funding for that kind of research in China or anywhere else, whether directly or indirectly. However, The Intercept interviewed this molecular biologist at Rutgers University, and he looked over these documents, and he says that they definitively show, with like beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the EcoHealth Alliance was using U.S. federal funds for this gain of function research in Wuhan, and federal funds specifically approved by Anthony Fauci and his agency. And this biologist, Richard Ebright, he put out this big long Twitter thread that people should check out. I'll read out just a couple passages that I think are important. He says, quote, "The materials show that the 2014 and 2019 NIH grants to EcoHealth Alliance with subcontracts to the Wuhan Institute of Virology funded gain-of-function research as defined in federal policies and potential pandemic pathogen enhancement as defined in federal policies," end quote. And then another line, he said, "The documents make it clear that assertions by the NIH director, Francis Collins, and the NIAID director, Anthony Fauci, that the NIH did not support gain-of-function research at Wuhan are untruthful." And so it seems pretty clear-cut to me. And this guy is not some kooky crank. He's a professor at a prestigious university. He's verified on Twitter. And The Intercept certainly didn't seem to think that he was any kind of like conspiracy theorist or something to interview him for their story. So this is some of the most interesting stuff about these documents. It kind of adds one more piece of the puzzle where it appears the U.S. government may have funded this dangerous research after all. Whether that means that the virus escaped from the lab, it's totally unclear. But whether they funded the research, it seems that is more proven now.
Right. And this is just one of those other common things, Will, where Anthony Fauci is somebody who, as we've documented on this show, and who is an admitted liar. He has said that, he misled people because he thought it would generate a better result. And so, maybe I don't think it would be a stretch for him to feel like, well, if my reputation is hurt because my reputation is so connected to the antivirus measures, I have to make sure my reputation is upheld, or else people are going to disbelieve that there's a virus or something crazy like that, right? I see no reason at this point that we should be taking Fauci's word for it. And this seems like one of the things that Congress could be pretty easily doing right now is having a commission put together and going through all the NIH documents and all these things that the CDC was doing and trying to figure out not just exactly, what the hell we are funding in Wuhan, but getting like an overall sense of what kind of like this research that they're doing in Fort Detrick and all over the United States, because I'm sure that other things are going on, and that this seems like something to be concerned about. And one of those things where once you get funding for it, well, to get funding you had to keep doing experiments, and so maybe just to keep making getting your budget, you got to keep doing different and crazier things, and you end up with some really dangerous results, I guess, is where I'm going.
Yeah. And now, in terms of like investigations, I did write a story on this. Rand Paul, I know, and a couple other Republicans have like been touting these intercept documents and calling for an investigation. And as you mentioned, Fauci, has a very, clear incentive to deny any possible link to this research. However, people might remember they when like a trove of Fauci's emails were released in a FOIA case. I think CNN and BuzzFeed and a few other outlets were behind it. But there was one email exchange in that trove of documents with Fauci's top deputy, Hugh Auchincloss. And it shows Fauci is clearly concerned that maybe his agency approved funding for this research. He sends Auchincloss this study that says, that has to do with gain of function research. And when you go and click on the study, it shows at the bottom that the EcoHealth Alliance was involved, and that actually their involvement in the study had been concealed initially, and that the scientific journal only acknowledged it later. But there's a message where Fauci is telling his top deputy to like look into this, and his top deputy says, I will see if we have any distant ties to this work abroad, to this gain of function research. So in private, there is some evidence of Fauci expressing concern that maybe his agency did fund this kind of work after all.
And Will, if Fauci really does want to make the American people believe that, what he's saying is true, you got to be upfront about this, because if they find out you're lying later, they're not going to, well, I mean, people get their reputations laundered and stuff like that, but he's a little old to have that happen. So, yeah. Do you have anything else on COVID? I had just a couple stories to hit on before we move on to Afghanistan.
No, go ahead with what you had.
So the first one I thought was important, and that is the Surgeon General says the U.S. will monitor whether vaccine exemptions are being used properly. One of the things that a lot of states have built into their law is either medical, religious, or philosophic objections to taking vaccines. Depending on what state you're in, you should look up the law and see how it actually works. In some states, they really do try to require that you have to be a part of a church that doesn't participate in medicine in order to get a thing. But really there is no official church or anything like that. So if you say my personal held religious belief that I have full autonomy over my own body and my spiritual nature, that should be enough to claim a religious exemption as far as what religion actually means. If your state has a philosophical exemption, I'm sure you're good with that. Different states obviously, lean different ways on enforcement here. But I found it pretty concerning that the Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy, hope I'm saying his name right, has accused or is saying that, we need to check on this because they're concerned that people are going to be taking exemptions that shouldn't. If people don't want to put this in their body, they have the right not to. The U.S. has signed on to a lot of international law that kind of makes it clear you can't force medicine on people. So I'm not sure exactly, if they're going to, really push in the courts to take away exemptions, but I think it's something to be concerned about. The next story I have is from Politico, and I just want to mention this. I'm not quite sure how significant it is or anything. I'm not saying that it proves some deep conspiracy or anything like that. Right. But there were two regulators who worked at the FDA who stepped down over the, I guess mostly Biden administrations, but the, White House, the government's decision to have people start getting booster shots, saying that there wasn't, I don't even think they were implying in any way that was dangerous or anything. I just want to make it clear. But at the same time, they were saying there was a lack of data to show that it was needed. Yes. Or that I guess it would be effective too. That's something that I've even seen just a lot of virologists point out that, this is a vaccine developed for the alpha variant of COVID, and now the main outbreak we're dealing with is the Delta variant, which the vaccine is shown to be less effective against. And so, there is a concern that you're just not going to increase the immunity that much if the virus changing is the reason the vaccine isn't as effective. But again, I'm not saying that like I'm a scientist and I know the answers. Just trying not to get this show taken down. The next thing we have is from Bloomberg, and that is Israel is now preparing for a fourth possible dose of the vaccine, and they're pretty strongly preparing. Well, it's not like they're in talks like maybe we're going to do it. They're buying enough vaccines so they will be able to give a fourth. Israel is the country that I believe is the furthest along in giving their population booster shots. I believe they said that they've had, given 2.5 million people a third dose of the coronavirus vaccines. Then just one other thing that was noted in this Bloomberg article is it was initially reported that Israel was going exclusive with Pfizer, and Israel says they're not, and they're actually giving Moderna doses for people getting their first vaccinations. Although there's not many people in Israel getting first vaccinations, because I think 88 to 90% of the country is now vaccinated. Yeah. It's a huge number, although there is a serious breakout in that country, which is causing some questions on the virus, how efficient it is. The last thing I have is going on in the United States here, and it isn't a major story, but Michael Tracy has a couple good articles on this. There's a small community college in Connecticut that has their students under a quarantine. I think they're in their rooms pretty much all day. They're not allowed to socialize with people, and they're taking online classes in their dorm rooms. As somebody who, knows that mental health in colleges is pretty rough, this has written potential suicide all over it. Like, kids are isolated from their families. The freshmen, those kids are isolated from their families for the first time, and now you're isolating them in their dorm rooms. Seems kind of dangerous. Also, he points out that this college required that everybody be vaccinated, and that the student body has a 99% vaccination rate, and they're doing this massive lockdown on the campus anyways. Tracy says that he's spoken with a lot of students and will have more articles out on that this week. But as he points out, I think he's making the great point, is that we have to speak out against it, because if we don't, they're going to try to replicate it.
Yeah.
All right, well, that's what I had on COVID. Let's move on and continue to update this drone strike in Kabul. We're learning new details. This was the murder of 10 people, and we're one of the largest shows actually still reporting on this. So let's get into it. We've updated this 4 or 5 times now as new details has emerged. How the U.S. carried out this drone strike, what authorities they used, and all that. So, Will, what did we learn from the New York Times?
Yeah. So just to begin with, I believe the Pentagon has now apparently acknowledged that it may have killed 3 civilians in this strike. They've actually put some number on it. As you mentioned, there is reason to believe that at least 10 people were killed, including 7 children. But apparently the government has now put out some number of its own. However, there is now evidence that really the Pentagon's entire story doesn't hold water. And you referred to a New York Times investigation that I'll get into in a second. But just to start with the official version of events, the military claims that a Reaper drone fired a Hellfire missile at a car that was carrying at least 1 ISIS fighter, as well as a large amount of explosives. And they say they literally watched the guy loading bombs into the car. They also claim that those explosives may have detonated in the drone strike and possibly, maybe hypothetically, killed those 3 civilians. But they say this is all necessary to prevent an imminent threat to the Kabul airport.
Well, can I just clarify something real quick? I don't think the Pentagon said they saw them load bombs into the car. They just said they saw them load heavy items into the car.
Right, okay.
Just to clarify that they didn't even know it was a bomb at the time, which I think goes to how irresponsible it was to carry out this strike, obviously.
Right. Yeah, I just had meant to say that they claimed to see somebody loading something into a car that made them suspicious that it could have possibly been explosives. But yeah, I don't think they actually identified them necessarily as bombs. However, that was one big part of their story, is that they saw them loading this stuff, into the car. So to them, they said this is a righteous strike. That is the government story. However, the last time we were on the show, or last time I was in the show, we said a lot about this strike, but there were 2 specific things that we mentioned. It was one, that we kind of just had to take the government's word that it was actually targeting an ISIS guy here, that we were never really shown any evidence for that. And 2, we raised some questions about this story of the secondary explosion. because we knew that the Pentagon had used that excuse before in another very questionable case where, it seemed a U.S. strike had killed a lot of civilians. Well, it seems that we were right to be skeptical about that whole narrative, because the New York Times put out this big investigative piece on Friday that casts a lot of doubt on whether the driver of this car had any ties to the Islamic State, B, whether there were any secondary explosions after the drone strike, and C, whether there were any bombs in this car at all. So it's pretty much refuting the entire official story about this strike, like exactly what happened, exactly who was targeted and who was killed. And this investigation is based on security footage that they obtained, like office security footage, which shows some of the driver's movements on the day of the strike. And then they also apparently interviewed more than a dozen people that are related to the driver. And the Times identified him as Zamiri Ahmadi. And last time I was on the show, we noted that all 10 victims had been identified from the same family, the Ahmadi family. And apparently that includes the driver of this car, too. Now, I believe the military did previously acknowledge that it didn't actually know the identity of the driver. They say that he was under surveillance and that they thought he was acting suspicious and that they saw him loading something into this car. But I'm pretty sure they admitted that they did not have any active specific intelligence on this guy or whether he had ties to the Islamic State. So with that admission in mind, this Times investigation, I think, is even more damning, because it looks like not only was Zamiri Ahmadi probably not a member of ISIS, and again, the government has no evidence that he was, but in fact, it looks like he was actually a humanitarian aid worker for an American NGO, this aid group called the Nutrition and Education International that's based in California, which I think you may have mentioned in the show previously. And he had apparently worked for them since 2006 as an electrical engineer. And we had noted that several of the other victims in this strike had worked as contractors under the U.S. occupation. Some had even applied for special immigration visas to come to the U.S. They had commendation letters that were vouching for them. So just kind of adding all this stuff up, it seems unlikely that this was some Islamic State family, that a lot of these people had ties to Western organizations. They worked with the U.S. government, with U.S. companies, with U.S. NGOs. And so this paints a very different picture from what the Pentagon has tried to claim about, this guy's ties to the Islamic State. Because U.S. officials told the New York Times that they saw Ahmadi leaving an ISIS safe house and that he was, acting suspicious. And that's why they started following his car with a drone. But the Times actually kind of was able to map out his movements that day using the security footage and by talking to some people he was with, specifically a few of his coworkers at his job. And they deny that there was anything suspicious about what they were doing that day. They had made a couple stops on their way to work. They picked some people up. They got breakfast. I think they picked up a laptop at some point. But at some point later in the day, I think they went to the local police station to get permits to pass out food to refugees. It was just a normal day for work for them, according to the people who were with Ahmadi that day. However, another very important thing that was captured in this footage, and I think this is very damning to a key point of the government story, is the footage shows Ahmadi filling up several large containers of water and putting them into his car. His coworkers say that water deliveries had stopped in his neighborhood. The Kabul government had kind of collapsed at that point. And so he had been bringing home water from the office to home. And a security guard interviewed by the Times is seen in the footage, and he confirms that, yes, I helped him load this into Ahmadi's car. And so these containers are most likely what the military is claiming what were, they thought possibly were explosives. And that's the only thing that Ahmadi is seen loading into his car that day. But these were jugs of water and not bombs. And the Times even talked to other passengers who were in the car that day, who were dropped off before the drone strike. And they deny that any huge packages of explosives had been loaded into the car, at least to their knowledge. I don't think they would want to commute home from work in a vehicle that might explode. We are talking about just local office worker people, not ISIS fighters or people who'd be comfortable around an IED or something. And so they say there was no bombs in the car. So Ahmadi dropped these people off. He went home. He pulled into his driveway, and that's when he was droned. That's when they blew up his car. And even though this is in a densely populated residential area in Kabul with literally people everywhere, the military claims that the drone operator only saw one other adult male in the area, so they were cleared for the bombing. Now, of course, Ahmadi's relatives, they dispute that. They say that Ahmadi's children and several of his nieces and nephews had run out to greet him when he pulled in, which would be consistent with reports of 7 children being killed. So that seems to match the other evidence and cut against the U.S. government's claim. And then the very last thing I'll say here, regarding this alleged secondary explosion, the Times actually sent people to the scene of the drone strike, and they say that there didn't appear to be any like larger second blast. They also had explosives experts look at photos and videos of the scene, and they say that there is clear evidence of a missile strike, but no sign of any secondary shock wave or anything that would indicate a second explosion. So that is basically what this New York Times investigation found. I would encourage people to go actually read the whole thing. They also put out like a 10-minute video version that people can watch. And I'll say we do often criticize mainstream media outlets like the Times, and often for very good reasons. But in this case, they did really good work. This is exceptional journalism that they did, and I would encourage people to go check it out.
Right. Now, the journalism needs to be used, though, to hold people accountable, because this was a murder of an entire family. I don't know,
That's
entire,
right.
but 10 people from a family, including 7 children. And, well, it shocks me how quickly the idea that we needed to save the NGO workers, that we needed to save the Afghan women and children, completely disappeared from the mainstream media narrative the second it was clear that the U.S. was the one that was responsible for racking up the bodies of, the people that we claim to be trying to save. And we're still waiting on more news about the suicide bombing at the Kabul airport and the allegations of, who actually killed everybody after that attack and everything like that.
Right, correct. Yeah, it seems to me in this case with this Kabul strike that the military felt like for optical reasons that, after the suicide bombing, that it had to go do something. It had to, show people that it meant business. And so it basically selected a random guy that, using their terrible targeting methods, their signature strikes where they look at signs of life that seem suspicious to them, which are usually just people going about their day mundane, in mundane ways. But it seems like they just used this as an excuse to take revenge and show that, look, we mean business and that you can't mess with us. And they ended up wiping out, a good chunk of the Ahmadi family in Kabul there.
Right. And Will, maybe it would be one thing if for 20 years they have used this idea where, we have these signatures that we look for, things that people are doing that are suspicious, and we use those to identify targets and hit them. And if that had been successful for the past 20 years and like 95% of the time I got the intended target or something like that, that would be one thing. But it's been the complete opposite the entire time. And so to continue to go with these policies is just disgusting. It needs to end. But I guess we should move on and talk about Israel a little bit quickly here, Will, because I know we're a little long already.
Yeah. I know there was some kind of like Shawshank prison break over there in Israel. I think there were 6 Palestinians. I'll do my best to pronounce their names. I studied Arabic in college, but I'm not fluent or anything. But the 6 guys who apparently escaped are Mahmoud Abdallah Arda. I guess one of his family members, Mohammed Qasim Arda, Yaqub Mohammed Qadri, Ayam Nayef Kamaji, and Zachariah Zubeidi, and Munadi Yaqub Infat. So those are the 6 dudes who had apparently escaped, and tell us more about the story.
Yeah, so 4 of the 6 of them have been given life sentences plus time by the Israeli government for being a part of the Palestinian resistance to Israel. I don't as far as I could tell, they weren't like particularly egregious people, but they were war fighters, essentially opposing a violent occupation. For this, I think 4 of them have done over 20 years. I don't think one of them had even been sentenced. And, Gideon Levy, I said his name right this time, at Haaretz, has a really fantastic piece that says, yes, the Palestinian prison escapees are freedom fighters is the title. And he basically talks about how these people were involved in the opposition to the Israeli, occupation, and that, Israelis who have committed similar crimes haven't been held responsible. He also talks about how horrific the prison conditions are for these men, and so they maybe you don't want bad people escaping from prison, but there is a certain level of conditions where people are being held in and they escape. You really can't fault them all too much, and this seems to be the case in this particular prison. Now,
I'm sorry, just one point of clarification. This is inside Israel proper, right? This was done not in the West Bank?
Yeah, but I think it's inside Israel proper, and it's about 18 miles from Nazareth.
Okay.
Yeah. So then the actual escape, I guess what happens over the course of what has to be years, these men find out that there's a pipe of or a tunnel of some kind that naturally runs under the prison. They get a rusty spoon that they hide behind this a poster and they are not a poster, something on the wall, and
Yeah.
they start moving the sink and then digging little by little by little, and eventually, yeah, get their way out. There's this great picture of like 5 Israeli, I guess, police of some kind standing around like one hole and just kind of looking at like how the hell did this thing
It's like
happen?
a cartoon, yeah.
Right. And so and all right, so that's the actual escape, right? So I guess there's like two aspects of this to talk about, which is the reaction from the Israeli population. This was a huge blow to the Naftali Bennett administration. It made them look bad. It made them look like the prisons are insecure. There are reports that it wasn't just that this was a crafty escape, but that the Israelis that were supposed to be at the watch post of this prison, which was supposed to be like a higher security prison, right. This was a place they claimed to hold very dangerous people, were either asleep at their post or not at their post at all. And so there was a hashtag going on around Israel that I think this combined with the sniper that was killed in Gaza that we covered on the show with Connor Freeman a couple weeks ago. They were hashtag untie our hands, believing that the problem of Israel is that they aren't mean enough and brutal enough to the Palestinians. And so, that's the Israeli perspective on this. The Palestinian perspective is that these people are heroes. Gideon Levy calls them freedom fighters. And I think, I got to sympathize with the Palestinian perspective a little bit more. One of the escapees was a high-ranking member of Fatah and actually did receive a pardon from the Israeli government in the past, but then it was rejected. There's a couple good articles on this at Mondo Weiss. And why, they're called our heroes. And one of the things that Yuna Patel points out, Will, that, it's just, one of those things that you learn about Palestine and are absolutely like sickened and shocked by. And that is 20% of the Palestinian population and 40% of the men have been in an Israeli prison at some point. And a lot of them, have been there unjustly, held for extended periods of time, only had trials in courts that they don't speak the language of in, trials in military courts. And so even if these are people that, it's not like they're nonviolent offenders or anything like that, Will, but at the same time, because of the fact that everybody in Palestine has been oppressed this way, there's just a lot of sympathy with them. And it's just kind of like a hell yeah, our side's winning one for once moment, I think, for the Palestinians.
Yeah.
Now, since the people broke out, there were, I believe, one big protest on Wednesday where 100 Palestinians were injured by the Israeli forces. There's a really good op-ed by the Mondo Weiss editors titled "Palestinians Warn of Uprising If Israel Seeks to Kill the Beloved Escapees," and basically saying, like, look, if you guys plan on getting these people back by carrying out executions, there's going to be a real protest against that in Israel. So far, they have actually captured 4 of them, although it seems like they've gone through some brutal methods to do it, including rounding up the families of the escaped men. It's not illegal to be related to a prisoner, even if, that person is guilty. And you can't just... Right. If you're a Palestinian, at least, they'll round you up if your relatives escaped jail. And so that was reported to have happened. Now, this was over the weekend, Friday night into Saturday. 2 of the escapees were arrested in Nazareth, and then the next morning, 2 more were arrested in al-Gon. I'm not sure I pronounced that second one right. Those are Palestinian villages. While the Israelis claim that they had help from Arab Israeli citizens, so that would be like Palestinians who are living inside of Israel proper and who have citizenship. There is no confirmation that that is the case. And it could just be Israeli propaganda. However, as of the recording of this, at least, two of those escapees are at large. Although I believe the most significant member of the escapees, the one that was a leader of Fatah, has been recaptured. And so I think that's why I have on this prison break, Will. It's, a story that's, very captivating because of the similarities to Shawshank Redemption. And I think there's just a human fascination with prison breaks. They just make documentaries about it, like art heists and stuff like that. People are just interested in it. And, of course, for the Palestinians, it's a real morale victory. Now, on Friday, I believe, Friday night after these men were arrested, there was a report of one rocket being fired by somebody, either Islamic Jihad or Hamas, I'm assuming, in Gaza into southern Israel, and that was intercepted by the Iron Dome. Israel responded by carrying out airstrikes against targets within Gaza. Now, Will, I want to point something out. I think these are all war crimes. I don't think that you could say that, a rocket was fired from this area, and then that gives you a right to carry out an airstrike on another target in that area, even if you are hitting a military target. Doesn't seem like that's collective punishment.
Gaza is one of the most densely populated places on planet Earth, too. We should remind people, too. So, yeah, shooting missiles into apartment complexes, very sure to kill innocent people every time.
Yep. And then I read just before going on that there was more bombing going on in Gaza tonight, Will, and possibility that was actually a pretty heavy round of bombardment. And so if that was the case, we'll probably have more details at the latest next week. We got a lot of Afghan stuff coming up this next week. The last story I had on Israel, Will, is that one of the young men who was shot in the neck during the protest at the Gaza fence, the bars of their giant prison that they are forced to live in. He has died from his injuries. He actually died, I think, about a week and a half ago. But he, just for this shocking number, the 73rd Palestinian child to be killed by Israel so far in 2021 is absolutely horrific. And again, when people talk about it, and the Israelis are upset over the sniper being killed, Israeli snipers are opening fire on Palestinian children. I think that the Palestinians do have a right to defend their children and a right to protest at the borders of their prison. It seems like that these events, the combination of the kind of protests have been stirring up in Gaza over the past few weeks anyways, those escaping from prison, maybe we're going to see some heightened protests in not only Gaza but the West Bank in the coming weeks, and so that'll likely mean quite a bit more violence by the Israeli occupation forces against the Palestinians.
And yes, and just notice, listeners, notice the contrast in news coverage from Afghanistan, where, oh my God, the poor civilians, we have to care about them so much, versus Palestine, where, little kids can get shot in the head with a sniper round every week, constantly, and it's just, you don't even hear a peep about it at CNN or MSNBC. Very clear where sort of their interests lie and how it's always sort of this pro-war, pro-empire spin. And they do not care about humanitarianism. They don't care about human rights. They don't care about the lives of foreigners.
Worse, whenever a rocket flies over the border of Gaza towards Israel, then suddenly the lives matter and you care, even though the number of Palestinians killed by Israelis is far, far higher. But, Will, we should wrap up there. Everybody, thanks so much for listening to the show. Please hit the share button. Please hit the subscribe button. Like the button. It's so hard for us to get anywhere in the algorithms, and so anything you could do to help us break through all the barriers that we face is really appreciated. We're putting out a ton of content. We've had bonus shows like the past 3 weeks. I got another one planned for this week. Clips coming out of every show. Just a ton of great stuff we're doing, so please do what you can to get it out there to more people and help our hard work pay off by getting it out to as many ears as possible. Will, thanks as always, co-host, and we will be back later this week for more shows.
Thanks, Kyle. Thanks, everybody.